Is the 12th of January 2023. I'm getting used to saying that. And the subject of today's Tech Hour is scientific notebooks from Galileo to today. And on the left part of the screen, there's about 15 URLs. And to begin with, what I'll do is I'll just go through those URLs very quickly to give an overview of the whole talk. So in the beginning, there was print. Well, that's not true. Prior to print, there was handwriting. And Gutenberg replaced handwriting by print for the copying of books. Now, we're talking about scientific notebooks, which are generally handwritten. And so handwriting is a good place to start. And I'm starting with the writing slate, which is important to our story. There's something called National Handwriting Day, which is on the 23rd of January. Those of you who are familiar with the United States culture know that John Hancock signed the Declaration of Independence, and he's famous for having a large and florid signature. So handwriting was important. Now, some of the important handwritten documents are logbooks on ships, particularly in this country because of Britain, because we have a long naval history. And the National Archives have got officers' logs going back to 1669. The word log, by the way, comes from throwing a log overboard to estimate the speed. And while we're talking about handwriting, we might as well talk about the fluid that is used for handwriting, which is ink. When I was at school, we had handwriting with fountain pens. We even had dip pens if you didn't bring a fountain pen to school. And some people had Stevens permanent blue-black ink. And he was the founder of, he built a fortune out of indelible ink. And there's a form of ink called iron gall ink or registrar's guild ink, which is for official use. And there's a man called Adolf Kaminsky who was involved in life-saving forgery. So he knew about removing ink. So far, so good. So I've come across three relevant definitions of notebook. The first is a writing pad, the second is a notebook computer, and the third is the notebook interface or the literate programming interface. Next, we'll move on to the last group of pages, which is the lab notebook. And Handwriting Day is something that the British Museum celebrated the lab notebook on Handwriting Day, which is 23rd of January. We're pretty well placed for that. There are volunteers available to transcribe Humphrey Davy's notebooks. There's Faraday's notebooks. The Pierre and Marie Curie lab notebooks are still radioactive, and you have to sign a disclaimer before you examine them. And then highlights for me are Galileo's notes on motion, Gauss's mathematical diary, Darwin's notebooks, the writings of Berman and Riemann, and in about 100 years ago, about 60 years after Riemann's death, Carl Ludwig Siegel did very important work based upon works in unpublished papers of Riemann. The most famous scientific notebook of the last century might be Einstein's notebook, where he develops general relativity. And then looking to this century, there's open notebook science. There's a mathematician, Dror Bar-Natan, who is doing that as one of the many people, or several people doing that. And that's the link that we provided. And finally, next month, there's a conference on machine-assisted proofs. And I've put that there because mathematicians like to write down proofs on a piece of paper and explain them with a chalkboard and so forth. That takes us back to the slate. And you can't do that when the proof is being done with a machine-assisted mechanism, a computer, unless the computers are set up appropriately. And that sort of brings us, if you like, to the conclusion I'm wanting to get to, which is that there's the world of digital paper and there's the world of handwriting, and both have benefits and disadvantages. The advantages of one are the disadvantage of the other in some sense. And we need to build bridges between the two so that people can move comfortably between the two forms. So at that point, I'll pause for breath and seek some advice as to how I should proceed. Oh, not forthcoming.
Well, I'm easy. As you know, I'm more interested in the latter end of the journey, specifically the use of tech or similar markup to tech in automated proving. So I hope we get to cover that.
Okay. Why don't I go through the slides in the pages in a sort of fairly sensible pace. So I'll start with the writing slate. The thing that I didn't understand until I did my research for this talk was that until the beginning of the last century, until about the 1900s, it was very, very common for primary school children to use a writing slate. They weren't given paper, they wrote on a slate. And the reason for that, I think, is cost. That slates become cheap compared to paper. Let me show you Hancock's signature there. It's quite ornate, and the American phrase for signing something is to put your John Hancock on it. So signatures have got into the language in that way, and it was a treasonous document. If the British had caught hold of Hancock, they would have hung him. The American Revolution is quite important because print and written documents were actually quite important. It was a revolution of ideas as much as a revolution of power. Let me move on to logs. So this is a chip log. They throw it out of the boat. It's on a rope, and you play out the rope as the log floats away. And every so often in the rope, there's a knot. And that's how knots became the measure of nautical speed. So you throw out the rope for perhaps a minute or 5 minutes, perhaps a minute, and you count how many knots go past. And that means 1 nautical mile per hour. And this goes back for a long time. I don't know how long, history. I think it's probably thousands of years, because the need to navigate has been there for a very long time. Now, the logbook requires paper and writing until you have electronic logbooks available. And it's a very, very important document regarding the handling of machinery, the navigation. It's the traveler's version of the account book. So you have the account book for the number and the logbook for events. And in computers, we're very, very used to having software writing logs as things happen. So the logs generated by software can be very, very important. And with tech, we have a log file that records interesting things that happen during the run of the device. thinking about this, and I haven't put a link in, when I was at school, we had a weather station, small weather station, at the front of the school. It was on pillars of white, on a slatted white box, so that the air could come in, but it was protected from the rain and the elements. And inside there was a piece of clockwork that moved a piece of graph paper around, and there were arms that moved up and down that recorded the air pressure and the air temperature. So that's an example of automated record keeping. It's probably one of the earliest examples of automated record keeping. So there are two sorts of logs: the ones that do automated record keeping that are done by computers, and the ones that are done by human beings. And in between there are the log entries that you put into your Git commits. So when you write Git log, you get a history of the commits, you get all the log messages. So Wikipedia, has examples of logbooks here, and they have a legal standing in that if it's not in the logbook and it happened, then there's something wrong. If it is in the logbook, the logbook is deemed to be the definitive record of everything that happened. And so if there's a court of inquiry that court-martials somebody, the logbook will be enormously important. And this was at a time, particularly on warships, where the captain had all the power of the king, including the power to execute. So this is quite important in a number of naval stories. For example, Moby Dick. So let's move on to the ink. So here's a picture of Inky Stevens, who was a Conservative politician, and he's, just a moment. I'm just gonna, sorry, I have to let Shamsi in. It's a bit difficult because attendee. Hi Shamsi, apologies for not seeing you immediately. I have minor problems with using computers today.
No problem. Sorry to be late.
All right. So the logbook was really a very important document. By the way, I read that in the old days, it was a hanging offence for anybody other than the ship's officers to keep a log and to reckon the position of the ship, because knowledge is power, if you like, or to put it another way, there's a predominant fear of mutiny aboard, and mutineers and lower ranks having their own ideas as to how the ship should be run and where they were is dangerous, contrary to authority. So logbooks are quite important. I was talking about ink. So iron gall ink has been used for 1400 years. And the Germans have regulations for unkodentiner ink, which I assume means indelible. And other countries have standards. if you get married in this country, you will sign the registrar, and the registrar will offer you a pen with special ink in it. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was long time the case. And that was part of the basis of Inky Stevens. And there was a regulation ink that had to be used for logbooks because the logbooks had to be proof against forgery. It was very important that they could be relied upon. So this brings me to Adolfo Kaminsky, who died quite recently, and I saw his obituary. So he died 3 days ago. Who specialized in the forgery of identity documents, saving. So what I read was that he would take an existing identity document for a person, remove the indelible ink that was associated with the person's Jewish name and Jewish background, and replace it by something that would be safer for that person. So he didn't exactly forge the identity document, he modified the entries on it. And there's a remarkable statement here, if I can find that. No, he was asked to forge 300 documents, and he was really tired, but he said to himself, if I sleep for an hour, then that's 30 documents I can't forge, and that's 30 lives that won't be saved. So I have to stay awake. And he used that to stay awake. So he worked very hard at this, and I think quite rightly, he is highly regarded. So his occupation was a forger of documents. Now, this might seem irrelevant, but handwriting is used to provide an element of security, if you like, which has now been taken over by electronic means in some sense. So we use cryptography to provide, and public key cryptography to provide security for documents. And previously it was your signature that in part attested that the document was your word. So you've got the same human function being used, being implemented, if you like, in different ways at different times. And that's quite important now, because the human functions relating to STEM communication are more and more being implemented using computers, not as a way of, you see, when Don Knuth started tech, it was a better way to produce printed pages. And it is an excellent way to produce printed pages. But now tech is very largely used as a way of producing electronic documents, and the electronic documents don't have to be facsimiles of paper documents. And in particular, breaking an electronic document into pages on the basis that you can only get 9 inches of text into a page doesn't make sense. The page breaking was done in order to save paper, if in rough terms. So on to notebooks. There's interesting, there are 3 major definitions of notebook. The first is a legal pad, for example. And what's interesting is that they only really became widespread with the rise of printing and the rise of manufacturing. And it seems that legal pads started in 1888. I guess the lawyers in Massachusetts who bought these things and used them could afford them, but the school children or the schools couldn't. And that's why we still had the slate in use. But as paper became cheaper and cheaper, and part of that, by the way, was the rise of the steam-powered press and the popular media. So this created a tremendous appetite for cheap paper, for printing cheap newspapers on. And in time, that really lowered the cost of blank sheets of paper. Whereas there was a time when a blank sheet of paper was a fairly precious object. And we're all familiar with older people that don't have throwaway envelopes because you can write on the back of them. And I have to say that I'm one of those people sometimes. So that's one form of notebook. Another notebook is the notebook computer or the laptop. And in the United States, two terms are used interchangeably. Now, they are both something that you can more or less put in your pocket that you can write on. So it's the same human function of recording information in a portable device, but it's managing this all in a different way. And then this sort of surprised me a little bit. In fact, it surprised me a fair bit, which is that Wikipedia has that a notebook interface or computational notebook is a form of literate programming, which the people in tech community know because Don Knuth did literate programming for when he wrote tech. He used this as a way of improving the quality of the software. By the way, Smalltalk has a very interesting interface to the program, to the source code, which is that every function, as I recall, is, so to speak, a web page, and it provides, as part of the environment, a browser for viewing and editing source code. And this is about 1983 or so, I think, that Smalltalk started to get going. So that's quite prescient. Alan Kay, the person behind the Xerox PARC project and Smalltalk, is a computer science in that he's won the Turing Prize, but he's trained as a psychologist. And I think his great strength is human-computer interaction, together with the willingness to learn what he needs to learn to do what he wants to do. So the notebook interface is, I think, the digital paper alternative to stuff on print. And the notebook interface is, for me, one of the great starting points and sources of ideas in terms of having a digital typography for the 21st century that works for print and for paper. So I've been reading papers from the archive, and they'll reference equation this and equation that and equation the other. When I'm reading it online, I've got plenty of room on my enormous screen, and I don't want a number. I want to see on the screen the relevant material for the part of the document that I'm reading. And if you're doing that on paper, that would be enormously wasteful and would be prohibited on the basis of cost. But if you're doing that on paper, but to do it on screen is doesn't cost anything. It's infinitesimal cost. So there's the idea of a notebook. And one of the things about the traditional view of a notebook is that it's something you can put in your pocket or into your satchel. It's always there with you, so it's portable. It's like your mobile phone. It's like your device. You can always carry it with you. And I'll just skip ahead to, if I haven't lost it, yes. Sorry. This is one of the nicest stories of last year. You can see that the missing Darwin notebooks returned to Cambridge University Library. And there's a picture of a very happy librarian. So these notebooks, in which Darwin first developed his tree of life, disappeared from the library. They were removed, I believe, for photography or for some other purpose and never returned. And then there was a big appeal to get them back, and they were anonymously returned. And here's an extract of that notebook. You can see from that its dimensions are quite small. It is really something that would fit into a shirt pocket if you had a. It's probably what, 2 or 3 inches across and 4 or 5 inches deep, and it just sort of flips open, and Darwin is getting 6 or 8 words a line, if that, 4 or 5 words a line. When I was at Cambridge, there was a big project to document all of Darwin's correspondence. So can you see that in the top right corner of the picture? The green volumes, that's Darwin's correspondence. There was an enormous project to record all the correspondence they could find of Darwin. And this is of tremendous importance for people who are interested in the history of science, and I think other things as well. I'll stop at that point on that. I think there's more interesting things here. Yeah, the bag came through. And here's what the librarian saw. So I'm not going to show you any more of that, but you've got the link and you can see that there's a lovely story here. So this is interesting. This is a website whose concern is we've got these notebooks, but they need to be transcribed. I think this is another example of the merging of the two forms of culture, the two cultures of writing, the writing on paper and the digital realm. And here we're using the internet, the connectedness provided by the internet to allow volunteers to transcribe Humphrey Davy's notebooks. If you don't know Humphrey Davy, so Humphrey Davy, the miner's friend, he invented the safety lamp, which made coal mining much safer because it would detect explosive gases without setting them off, and it also provided illumination. So Humphrey Davy was followed by Michael Faraday, who was a tremendous experimentalist, particularly with electricity, but in many other areas as well. Faraday was succeeded by, in many ways, by James Clerk Maxwell, who provided the mathematical foundations for the experimental discoveries that Faraday made in electromagnetism. And Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism allowed radio waves to be invented, and they also provided the physical problem that Einstein's special theory of relativity solved. So this is all important stuff from the 19th century. Let me show you this page, which is Bernard Riemann's hypothesis manuscript from 1859. This is important because it contains a problem, and if you solve it, you'll get $1 million and eternal fame. And many people have, several good mathematicians have believed they've solved it, but they haven't. And it seems to attract people who are amateurs. So that's the Clay Mathematics Institute, and they've offered prizes for important mathematical problems. And I think only 1 or 2 of them have been solved so far. And here's the manuscript that contains the hypothesis, the Riemann hypothesis, for which there is so much money available for solving. So I'm just going to close a few tabs now to keep things a bit tidier. This is a 20th century notebook. John Norton is an expert in Einstein and relativity. And this Look at this. So Einstein's got quite a nice hand, actually. It's a sort of, I think in Germany they have something called orthography, which means writing correctly. So you have this sort of somewhat copperplate way of writing, and his writing seems to be of that nature. So there's that. I'm going to move on now. So this is Einstein's notebooks, which he wrote for his own purposes, and when he was ready, he would publish things from it. Now today there's something rather different, which is closer in field to open source computer program, which is open notebook science, which means that you make the lab notebook and other things available more or less as you create them. Well, I'm not going to go into this because I don't know the details, but the basic idea is you publish everything, you make everything available. And that greatly improves the opportunities for collaboration, or at least it can. So the next one is actually a link from this page, which is, when we get there, we don't have it. I'll go to it directly. I'll make it a bit bigger. So this gentleman tries to publish everything. So this is a random look. Yeah. Do you see what he's done? He's been to a talk at this date, at this time, and he's written some notes. And everybody can see it. Harish-Chandra isomorphism. I can probably read the rest of it as well. So that's a way of doing science. By the way, his handwriting isn't nearly as good as Einstein's. And the final thing I'm going to go to is something. Oh, I have to fix that. But this is of great importance to the tech community, because one of the important things that tech is used for is for writing proofs, for writing mathematical proofs. Now, tech, if you use tech to write the proof, there is a guarantee that the typography, the drawing, the symbols, the sort of the typesetting instructions required to produce the printed representation are computer readable. But for machine-assisted proofs, there's a requirement that the semantics, and not just the semantics of algebra, the semantics of mathematical proof, be available. And this is now a thing, and it's a growing and important thing. And one of the major recent successes of machine-assisted proofs is that Peter Schulze, who's a number theorist and a Fields medalist, had some results that were foundational for things he wanted to do that would greatly simplify his branch of mathematics. And he wanted to be sure that the results were correct. And one of the reasons why he wanted to be sure that the results were correct is that there's a long outstanding, or perhaps notorious, conjecture called the ABC conjecture in algebraic number theory. And a Japanese mathematician claims to have a proof, and nobody understands it well enough to accept it or to deny it. And Scholze was one of the people that came in and reviewed the whole thing and said, it seems very much that the proof goes round in a circle, and it comes back to the starting point, and it assumes that the object that you come back to at the end is the object you started with at the beginning, but it might be a different object with similar properties. And that's the hole in the proof, is that you go in a circle, but the circle doesn't join up, leaving a gap. So he's aware of the difficulties and complexities of algebraic proof. There was another algebraic geometer, Alexander Verdovsky, also a Fields medalist, who published something, and I think it was a postdoc, somebody fairly junior, had the temerity to say, I think there's a mistake in your proof. And something very wonderful happened, which is Verdovsky looked at it and he said, yes, there is a mistake in the proof. It was quite brave of the young person to say, I think there's something flawed in this proof. In the 1920s, there was another mathematician, Solomon Lefschetz, who I have a great deal of respect for. And it was said of him that you should trust his results, but not his proofs. And he produced a very important result, the Hard-Lefschetz theorem. And that wasn't proved until about 15 years after he stated he'd proved it. And that required the work of William Hodge using entirely different methods, and was a very important result. So the question of proof in mathematics is important, and mathematicians are looking to machine-assisted proofs as a way of checking their work and keeping themselves honest and perhaps being better able to make progress. So if we go back to what Scholze did, he wrote his ideas and his outline for a proof using TeX, of course. So there's this document explaining all of his mathematics that he wants to have rigorously proved, and a number of people got together and proved enough of the statements he was making in order to remove the doubt that he had. And the situation was rough if we transpose this to a different area, it was that the specification for the proof was written using TeX, and the content of the proof was used the machine proof assistant Lean. And if you, so to speak, merge the two together, a bit like shuffling cards, then that's what literate programming is, as Don Knuth practiced it, which is the document is divided into sections, and each section has two parts, one of which is a description of what should be happening for the human, and the second part is a description of what should be happening for the computer. So that's the sort of thing that is going to be important in the next 50 years, just as the stuff that TeX was dealing with and so ably provided the route forward for was so important for the last almost 50 years. TeX started in 1978. Oh, so it is over 50, 78, 50. Yeah, well, we're almost there up to 50 years. We're about 45 years. So to try and bring everything to a conclusion, the way to pull everything together is to think about communities of people who need to communicate with each other. That's the first thing. And then the other thing is, who are successfully doing what we want to be doing in the future? And in that respect, one of the most important groups are the people who developed the Linux kernel. because they need to have the rigor that mathematicians need. They need things to be machine readable. They need to have high degrees of collaboration. They need things to work together, so they need lots of interfaces. What they're dealing with is big and complicated and has to be reliable. So the process of building these bridges is collaborative, and the best collaborators are the ones that listen to other people, as well as those who have the best thoughts and can inspire other people. I'll stop at that point and try and take questions. Maybe I'll stop screen sharing as well, if I can find the right window.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
I have a bit of a one-track mind lately. So I wanted to ask if you have thoughts about accessibility and how it ties into this topic.
Yes. The people who require accessible documents have to have a strong involvement in the community that develops them. So their voice has to be heard. I think that's the single most important thing that's important, is the people who are the beneficiaries need to be politically empowered. When I say politically, I mean having something akin to power or influence. That may not be the answer you're expecting. Maybe you're expecting a technical answer.
No, that's very interesting.
Other people can answer the same question in a different way, and I'm sure there'll be something to be taken into account. Oh, talking of accessibility, one of the people I mentioned earlier was disabled, and that's Solomon Lefschetz. He was studying engineering, and through some terrible accident, the details of which I haven't seen anywhere, he lost both his hands.
Mm.
And he had a sort of device into which he could put a piece of chalk, so he could use a blackboard. He would go into the elevator and wait there, and then ask somebody who came in to press the button, I think. But certainly he was in an accident, in an industrial accident. He lost the use of his hands, and I thought he deserves a great deal of respect for overcoming that and having a second career.
Mm-hmm.
And he's one of the major mathematicians of the American mathematicians of the 20th century. He was sort of brought out of retirement to take an important role in the American response to Sputnik. If you remember, the Sputnik satellite showed that the Soviet Union was more than farms and tractors, and was able to steal a march technologically, if you like, on the Americans. And the Americans sort of shook up and said, "Oh, we've got to deal with this threat from the Soviet Union," which led to things like the National Science Foundation being established. So he had a role in that too.
Thank you, Jonathan. Something I thought I mentioned. You talked about open science notebook, and the idea has been around for a long time. but I don't think many people are using it. And the reason I mention that is I keep the problem with plagiarization and cheating in science. I don't know if you're aware, but it's horrendous, and it's increasing, where people are copying pictures from one paper to another within the same paper. There are paper mills who you can pay. If you want a paper in Journal of Pharmacology or whatever, they'll write you a paper in your name, and you pay them, couple of $1,000, depending on where you want it published, and they'll publish it for you. And there's a big problem now in finding these. In fact, I was at a conference recently, STM, it was beginning of December actually, STM Association, and they had one day only on research integrity. And it's amazing how many people were there with the title Research Integrity Officer, which a couple of years ago you never found. Though I've never heard of such a person, but there were around 10 people from Springer Nature with the title Research Integrity Officer, right? So this is a big problem in publishing. And I've got a minor involvement in, I don't know if you've heard of the lady called Elizabeth Bick, Dr. Elizabeth Bick, B-I-K. If you look her up, she found that she's Dutch, but living in San Francisco, and I'm sort of lucky enough to be in communication with her. And what she does, she found that she was looking at the paper, and she found, oh, I've seen this picture before. And she's got this sixth sense of picking up these things like, microscope pictures that are similar or have been rotated and used in the same paper in different papers. And if you look up, I'll put the link in here, but in a site called PubPeer, where anyone can go in and basically make a comment anonymously on any other paper, and the authors are asked to comment. She's putting something like 3 or 4 a day on there and saying, oh, this figure A looks like similar to figure C. So I love what she's doing, and I haven't, even when she says there's the same, I just can't work it out. But my little contribution has been to actually get my colleagues in our multimedia department to animate these, just so that you can see, rotate and bring them together. I'll give you a link to that. But anyway, the reason I mentioned that, it's actually a big problem, and it's going to get bigger, I think, with this, whatever it's called, Chat GPT or whatever it's called, where you say, write me a paper on pharmacology, and it'll write you a paper on pharmacology, create the pictures for it, it'll create the pictures, and how is the publisher supposed to know? Right now there's a problem, but it's going to get even worse. So you reminded me that the best way around this is to have something like open notebook science, or something that I've suggested before, which is micro publishing. Don't wait until you have a paper to publish. It's too late then to find these things. But if you micro publish little bits, it's more difficult for you to forge a sort of paper at the end. So that's what came to my mind.
Does anyone want to comment on that?
It is a new and very tricky problem that we're hearing more and more chatter about, and brings up some really interesting ethical issues. And the openness that you're pointing to, Kaveh, is definitely the type of solution that I think has allowed a system like arXiv to even exist. It's like it's a group endeavor. Yeah.
I'm just putting some things in here.
In a court of law in this country, in England, I believe, you can't admit a photograph by itself can't be introduced as evidence. What you have to do is you have to have additionally, evidence that the photograph was, so to speak, honestly come by has to have a provenance. So you might have to produce the photographer, for example. Similarly, for some time, the evidence of a radar gun wasn't allowed without an expert witness. So the issue is that somebody submits a paper. By that analogy, that paper is just the output of ChatGPT without some sort of supporting evidence. And somewhere in the evidentiary chain, there have to be people saying, I saw this, I did this, this is correct. Somebody very astutely said in relationship to the problem of fake news, lying is not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. So in some sense, the solution to the problem of lying is the same as the solution to the problem of lying 100 years ago. But it has to be adapted to the changed circumstance. And I'd assume that the problem of people printing rubbish or people submitting to the newspaper rubbish or to the journals rubbish has to be dealt with in a similar way. I think that we have this habit regarding food of wanting to overeat because we're sort of genetically accustomed to food being scarce. So if there's a lot of food, we have a strong habit to eat as much as we can. And similarly, we're sort of accustomed to information being scarce. So whenever we have the opportunity for information, we take advantage of it. And we read the newspaper from cover to cover and all that sort of stuff. And certainly as a child, I didn't have an enormous number of books. And, you know, the books I had, I read. But nowadays, the problem isn't not enough information, nor is the problem not enough calories. The problem is too much information and too much calories. Now, publishers such as Springer have a role here, which is to assure the quality of the product. And that, I think, is why Springer has so many integrity assurance officers, is because that's one of the services they provide that justifies the cost of the journals. Why should I read my science from Springer and promote people on the basis of published articles rather than go to the archive? And the answer is that Springer is providing a quality assurance. Just as if I'm going to consume glucose by putting it in a solution and drinking it, that's one thing. But if it's going to be injected into my body, that's another thing. And so the quality assurance of the scientific information is really very, very important. Now, in mathematics, the formal methods will provide perhaps a gold standard for quality assurance, in that the formally checked proof, the proof that it's been checked by a computer, should be beyond all doubt. But other systems can't have such integrity. So I think what I'm saying is there's no solution that fits everybody, and it's not a new problem, but it does need new solutions. And it's something that's part of the whole situation. And I'm really glad that Kaveh is here, being part of a small community, very small community, that is discussing these things and seeing them as important.
Yeah, you're right about sorry, just quickly, that the publishers, clearly they don't want to publish junk science in science, if you like, but suddenly it's become a big problem, and it's actually very difficult And part of the problem is the sort of gatekeeping, if you like, the funnel that the paper has to go through. Who sees it? It goes through maybe 2 or 3 reviewers. You cannot expect the reviewer to know that this photo was, this picture was published in another journal 2 years ago by the same author. It's very difficult to find. So it is a major problem.
When print was expensive, there was a assumption that things would be properly proofread, and that put some constraints of quality onto things. And today, when I read something that's in print, particularly if it's somewhat prestigious, and I find a typo or a misprint or a spelling mistake in it, I'm sort of half outraged, or a little bit outraged, that this should have got through. But on the BBC website, I saw an article. Now, there's the word bear, and there's 2 ways of spelling the word bear, all using the letters A, B, E, and R. But one of them is the animal, and the other is exposed. So a barefaced lie has got nothing to do with the animal. It's overt. And another meaning of the word bear is a burden, or women bear children. And in the text of the article, the meaning was a burden on women. Something was a burden on women. And in a video clip from which the text was based, they'd obviously used voiced text, or I think they'd used voiced text, and it had the wrong bear in it. It had B-A-R-E, where in the article correctly had B-E-A-R. I could pretend to get annoyed and send an email in and so forth, but everybody's working to a budget, and this is the standard we have. So, to a certain extent, trying to prevent this this tide of fake science is perhaps not the right approach. Perhaps the better approach is to promote and value trustworthy sources. So don't try and stop people lying. Just try to promote the sources of information that are true, that have high reputation. So you could perhaps think of a different approach is to look at reputation. How can we make sure that articles have the reputation they deserve? That's a different way of solving the problem. You can publish whatever you want, but you won't get any reputation if what we publish isn't good. If you could bring that about, that would be sufficient. I've got a different topic to introduce, if nobody minds, which is something I meant to put in and I forgot to, but I'm reminded now. There's a man called Neil Sloan who has created what might best be described as not open science, but an open filing cabinet. So he is the founder of the online encyclopedia of integer sequences, which has, I think, 200,000 or 300,000 entries. It's one of my favorite websites, and in many ways, so any sequence of integers you care to think of, the powers of 2, the Fibonacci numbers, the primes, all manner of sequences are in there. And if they're not in there and you have a good reason to think that it's interesting or important, then you could submit it. And there's rules for submitting it. And you get these articles that have hundreds of references for some of the important sequences. And you have auxiliary stuff like somebody sent Neil Sloan a letter at one point and is put in as an auxiliary for that integer auxiliary item for that integer sequence. I remember seeing, actually it's related to the tech world, because it was Vice President of TUG is Arthur Rathenauer. And if I'm correct, his father is Rudolf Rathenauer, and he published a paper which had some errors in it. And that paper is referenced in the online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences. And in the online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences, it says, there are some errors in this paper reported to me by Christoph Rathenauer. And then there's a link. And the link is to a scan of a PDF with some handwriting on it from Christoph Rathenauer. So what happened was that Christoph Rathenauer sent this thing to Neil Sloan. Or sent the scan to Neil Sloan. The scan got put into the data, into the sort of the file store of the online encyclopedia, and there's your link and there's your reference. And that's what, though it's that sort of thing that makes me think that actually what we've got is a filing cabinet. And that brings me to something that is closer to my heart, which is I'm past retirement age, and I've perhaps got 10 years in which I can actively do my mathematical stuff. And I like to leave it in a state where other people can pick things up if they wanted to. So if we look at Darwin's collected papers or the stuff of Einstein or that sort of thing, well, I'm nothing like those people. But if I could bring all my notes and so forth into a sort of pre-digitized format so that they could be available as an archive, that would be great. And in a certain sense, for the community we're interested in, perhaps the carrot is don't wait until you're no longer here to start building your online digital archive of all your papers and manuscripts and so forth, or at least the ones that are important. Why not start building it now? So that's what Dror Bar Natan is doing, because his lecture notes have gone into his open science repository. And whilst other people may not be as broad in what they put in, it would be nice to record the communications I have with people in something a bit better than email. Somehow I'd like to have some repository for my correspondence, for example, that isn't email. I'd like my emails to go into a repository where they could be shared and referenced and that sort of thing. So maybe part of the community, which I didn't talk about very much, is the libraries, and sort of how do we ensure that the researchers of today leave behind a scholarly residue which might be as important as that of Faraday and Darwin, in a form that is accessible and useful.
So I have something to add on that from a formal mathematics point of view, if you'd like to hear.
Yeah.
So for those of you who are programmers, I'm sure you know that JavaScript took off about a decade ago now. And one of the things that made it successful, well, the main thing that made it successful was a new platform called Node. And this came with the package manager. And so you publish packages to a central repository, much like CTAN. So the idea of a central repository for programming resources is not something that's new. In fact, I wonder whether CTAN has some claim to be the first such digital repository for shared programming resources, because it must go back now When was it? Do you know, Jonathan, or does anyone know when the Comprehensive Tech Archive network kicked off?
Around 1992.
Oh, right. Okay. So 1990s. Yeah. So it predated NPM by 20 years. But that's the reason I mentioned Node is because it's specifically a programmer's resource, a JavaScript resource, and is I guess in some sense more, shall I say, principled. Although you can't really say that about JavaScript, and certainly not most of the stuff that's on NPM. But if you take that step further and you say, why not a central repository for formalized mathematics, then this addresses the problem of, to some degree, of relevance and credibility, because the only stuff that gets published there has been verified. And so this is one way, at least in the subjects, well, I think it really only holds for subjects that can be verified, which is really just maths and logic and things like that. But you could expand it to things like physics and so on. Then you combine verification with a central repository or even a distributed repository, but a public repository. Then you have something that's, I think, future-proof and allows people to leave a legacy that remains relevant.
I think that the archive has had a tremendous role. When I was a graduate student, the way you got hold of preprints was they were sent to the library of the Mathematics Institute and you saw them there. And there was a sort of standing arrangement that preprints and similar reports from, for example, Aarhus in Denmark would be sent, at least in particular areas, to the Warwick University Mathematics Library. And with the internet, people started putting preprints up on their web pages. And with the archive, you simplify the whole matter in a large number of ways by having a single place where all these preprints are. Now, the archive, quite rightly in its early history, is focused on documents, papers, that sort of thing. And I think one of the challenges that will face the accessible age is, what do we do with the artifacts that are not directly related to paper, such as, for example, if my paper relies on a large calculation for its value, if my paper is a report on a large calculation, then where do I put the resources to do that large calculation? Where do I put the software, for example? And the archive isn't set up to be a software repository, but the software has to be stored. So there's a whole bunch of problems to be solved. I'm getting much more human-based now that I'm older, and see the important thing as getting the right people together in the right room, and getting people together. Getting the right people together at the right time in the right circumstances. So getting the conversations happening and getting the shared resources as being the really important thing. There's something called the law of the instrument, which is if the only thing you've got is a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And if the only tool you've got is writing software, then you see everything you see as a problem to be solved by writing software. And I am now much more interested in the human sides of problems and the community side of problems. So sometimes the problem is these people don't talk to those people. That's really what the problem is. And you can't solve that just with a piece of software.
Right. And then you begin catching things upstream. When you think in terms of community, it often means like catching things much earlier. It's preventative.
Oh, how could we do better? That's what you mean, isn't it? Sort of learning from our experience and learning from our
Sure.
mistakes.
Or changing paradigms altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a great fan of air accident investigation reports. They're tremendous documents. They're reports, so they're documents, but they're the result of a process. And over the course of about 100 years, which is about the time period they've been going, they've done an enormous amount to improve aircraft safety, passenger flight safety. And every time I read one of those, I'm impressed in some way or another. There was a light plane that had to make an emergency landing because a baggage hatch, it's like the trunk of a car, had fallen, come off and struck the tailpiece of the tailplane of the plane. And the air investigators happened to get hold of a snapshot that showed this patch open because the people had stopped to have a picnic or something. And that was part of the evidence that they gathered up. And that photograph helped show that the problem was that the latching mechanisms had been removed to paint the plane and then reassembled incorrectly.
Oh.
And that's just, a four-seater plane. And it was sort of an 8-page report, and it got to the center of it. There was one accident where some cowlings of the engine weren't properly closed, and they said that the signs for the ground crew in the aircraft area of the airport were only at the pilot's level, but they weren't at the ground crew level, and that contributed to the ground crew going to the wrong aeroplane to check things. So they really take their opportunity to find out what went wrong, and without judging, what could be done to improve things. That's part of the ethos of tech. There's a sort of piece of poetry by somebody called Piet Hein, who's Danish. The road to wisdom, well, it's plain and simple to express, air and air and air again, but less and less and less. And famously, Don Knuth kept a log of the errors of tech, and he analysed that log to find out what sort of errors were occurring and what their frequency was. And the whole purpose of literate programming / scientific notebooks is to reduce the number of errors and to understand and learn from the errors. And the need to communicate is really important, and it's something that the rise of print allowed. There was before print, maps were basically secrets and much too valuable to be taken out on voyage. But when maps were printed, then you could have multiple copies. And one map maker said, if you find an error in our charts, let us know and we'll fix it. And that sort of thing is not possible without print, because if I find an error in a book, I know that every other book has that same error. It's not something peculiar to my book, that the letter I is missed on from this word in this page. And so I can send that error back in. And that's exactly the same when you report an error in documentation on GitHub in a piece of software. And one of the great things about Git and GitHub and similar tools such as GitLab is that you can fork the project, fix the error in your fork, and submit a pull request. And you can do all of that inside your browser, and the person at the other end can accept that change, and again, entirely within their browser. So that is one of the great enablers for the sort of distributing micro-publishing sort of thing that Garvey is talking about, and the ability to, so to speak, crowdsource thing. And the Humphrey Davy, digitizing Humphrey Davy website, I believe has similar capabilities in terms of not only is the digitizing open to crowdsourcing, anybody can go in, make a suggested change, but one can also do the proofreading that way. So the capabilities of the internet and the widespread availability of things can be used for all sorts of purposes, some of which are wholesome. I stop.
Jonathan, yeah, I had one comment back on the idea of just having the article and not having the source. Archive has created this Archive Labs project where we have outside sources that basically are keeping track of code, like, so you can link your code and your data. And there's another labs project that links like computer simulations along with paper. So there is an attempt to kind of keep some of that together and archive it.
So it's a sort of overlay.
In a sense, yeah, we're basically linking out from particular articles. If you go to certain articles, it will, and if you look at the lab section, it will tell you if there's, code is available for it or if there's a simulation. So,
I didn't know about that feature, probably just because I've never come across a paper that had it.
yeah.
It's really good. It's
actually,
just the right thing.
There's an Archive Labs page you can go to if you're interested.
Actually, I came across that today. I went to Archive and I saw Archive Lab, and I was just playing about with the different. I said, I Archive Lab, what's that? And you can download the PDF, you can download a bundle, you can download different things, and some of the files were quite big, I think. So I'm planning to have another look at that. I noticed the download was quite slow. Is that right? Is that limited?
I guess it would depend on the size of what you're downloading. I believe you're talking about, our main abstract page has links to the labs. So
yeah.
So that's
okay, maybe. Okay, I plan to look at it again. I think you're right. Maybe it was just the link, but it was something I hadn't seen before. Thank you for that. But that's great that the Archive are doing that. It's the kind of thing. And as I was actually talking to someone from BioArchive the other day, who you're familiar with. There a lot of things are going on in the preprint world, if you like. And it's quite interesting for me. I'm also on the if you like, on the traditional side of publishing, and I see this merging together of, say, BioArchive with the traditional publishers. If you look at eLife, for example, it's really an overlap between what's going on there. For example, there are now sites that I think Reviewer, not Reviewer Commons, Reviewer something, I forgot, but you can now peer review. It's basically a site just for peer reviewing. So you can peer review something that's BioArchive. Then it goes to publication. Well, that's also peer reviewed on that site. It's a very interesting time of what's going on there. And I think BioArchive and Archive can play a really great role there.
Was it pre-review? Was that the service? There's one service that I've looked into a little bit called pre-review.
That's right. There's pre-review. The other one, which it's a relatively new one, and I know the guys. I'll tell you in a second. If I don't, I'll email you. Yeah, I'll find in a second for you. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting that
Yeah.
as long as the underlying source is open and there's good communication and interoperability, there's a lot that you can layer on top of that. For example, community review, or like David was mentioning, links to code or simulations, probably a lot of other things.
And of course, the other thing about this, going back to the plagiarization and this thing of going through a gatekeeper, if you like, having things open early on a preprint server, that allows more people to look at it and maybe find these problems that we talked about. Whereas if it's not, if the only time you see it is once it's gone through just 5 or 6 people, you've got far less of a chance of seeing something to say, well, I've seen that picture somewhere. Or the other thing, I don't know if you've, sorry to this, these paper mills, what they do is one of the things they do is they take a paper from somewhere, they run it through something else to reword it so that so you can't find it with traditional plagiarization checkers, if you like. So the text is not exactly the same. You can't Google it. But what it does is it brings up, if you read it, it sounds very strange, and it's called in publishing, or the sort of publishing parlance, they call it tortured phrases. So, for example, what was it? For example, it'll change a phrase into something else, which the computer thinks it's equivalent. So, for example, a single molecule becomes an unmarried molecule, something like that. Okay. And you find there's a paragraph again, because I'm on this, on Twitter, I follow people, and someone said, "What the heck is this?" And if you read it, it's just full of these, normal English. And it's interesting when you take jargon and bring it back into English, you get these tortured phrases. That's another layer of stuff that we have to deal with. But there are publishers who just publish this. These are what are called the predatory publishers. Who publish these, and obviously not many people read them, and they just go on, on your number of citations that you've had, and so it's a pretty complex field. But openness in general can only help, I feel.
Right. Well, I think that the chat GPT system is going to present a challenge, because it's definitely generating papers that are very difficult to identify as produced by AI.
Absolutely, yeah. And I at this conference, I suggested, if you think things are bad now, they are going to get worse, because even if you sit down and read it, it reads fine. The other thing is some of the graphics that you can actually say, create a microscopic image for me of something that I might see if I mix this and that, and it'll produce a really good image for you. And you can get the data. You can produce the data for me too. So if the publisher wants the data, you can give the data. What are you going to do? It's a tough problem. It's right. Not simple.
Right. And we want to avoid the trap, like Jonathan was saying, of turning it into a problem where our only tool is better and better technology. Like I had posted an article, a New Yorker article about this Elizabeth Beck, who I'd never heard of. And
yeah,
I'm over here in my archive Slack channel, and one of our admins was like, "Oh yeah, read this article about her." And they mentioned some of the things that are pushing people to use these services, like really unrealistic publishing quotas for scientists in China that maybe you cannot reasonably meet without cheating or without, buying fake papers. Like, those are social problems, not technological problems. So we don't want to.
Absolutely right. Well,
we want to have a lot of different hammers or different tools.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of the problem is the pressure to publish. Publish your period. Yeah. You have to publish. What are you going to do? And you have to publish in a famous journal. So and in China, I believe you get, if you're an academic, you get a bonus for publishing in a journals, and the bonus goes up as the, you know, as the journal gets more and more important. So if you get a paper in Nature, I think you get something like a $10,000 bonus because you publish in Nature. No one's going to, you know, the admin's not going to read it, but you get that. So that you're absolutely right. There's that's one of the problems that, you know, the rating, how you credit academics is by number of papers and where they were published. That's it. That's primarily it, unfortunately.
Right. And citations. Yeah.
Yeah, citations, exactly. Yeah, but you're right. And Elizabeth Bix, she was that was quite recently. She got in the New York Times, and that's when she became. I mean, she was famous already, but that's another layer of how, you know, she's become a real superstar. And she sits by herself in, you know, in her room, and I don't know how she finds these. There are now some tools. Up to now, she said, you know, I've tried. You know, there are no tools to find these, but there are at least 3 tools now that check. What they do is they go and take the images from one paper, and they have a database of images from other papers everywhere, and somehow they find matches. And it's one of them's it's called actually Image Twin, and again, I know the guys there as well. It's a new startup, but Elizabeth uses Image Twin specifically because even if you even when it says there's an overlap here and you look at it by eye, you simply can't see it. So what we did was we did an animation. One of them was very good, actually. Only when you animate and put it on top of each other, then you can see, oh, goodness me, this area goes complete, and you reverse one of them, you find that it's a sort of gray, but it's very, very difficult to find. Yeah, that was a. So these tools are coming out. The irony is the guys who are making the money, the paper mills, they're probably using these tools already. They're already ahead of us. So, you know, catching up with these is difficult. So as I say, in this conference, I said, hang on, if I were a paper mill, I would get all of these tools and make sure I run them all. And if it doesn't catch anything, I'll send it to the journal because they're using the same tools anyway. So it passes those. So what are you going to do? Tough problem.
Yeah. I've got as I heard something recently that's, I think, relevant. I preface this by, in the 19th century, there was a tremendous amount of fraud regarding commodities. You know, you see something as advertised as something, and in fact, it was thoroughly adulterated. And in the 20th century, the United States introduced the Food and Drug Administration for similar sort of purposes. And on BBC Radio 4, they have a program called The Life Scientific, and the recent issue was of somebody whose name I've forgotten, who was, roughly speaking, a forensic food biologist. And one of the high points of the interview was his involvement in the discovery that supermarkets were selling as beef pizzas and lasagnas and that sort of stuff that wasn't, lasagnas I think particularly, that wasn't beef, or it wasn't entirely beef. It also had horse in it. And the scientific side of the microbiologist was the development of tests for this sort of thing. And by the way, he pointed out that spices such as oregano are worth thousands of pounds a ton. So adulterating spices is much more lucrative than adulterating even beef. And oregano, people were putting olive leaves into oregano and adulterating it perhaps 20%. And that's a fair old margin as an adulterer. And the adulterers thought that the olives leaves were being detected, and so they switched to strawberry leaves, but they were still detected because this chap had developed a fingerprinting mechanism whereby there's a sort of biochemical fingerprint of unadulterated oregano, and if you deviate from that, then there's something going on. Well, to get to the nub of this, he was in charge, I think, of some report about what to do about all these supermarkets and other shops being sold adulterated, being sold horse when in fact it's beef. Sorry, being sold beef when in fact it's horse. So the supermarkets or their suppliers are receiving a lorry load of beef, but in fact it's not a lorry load of beef. And this chap's response to this was quite interesting. He said, this is not a biological problem. It's not a food safety problem. It's not a monitoring problem. It's a crime problem. What they're doing is criminal, and you need a food crime agency. I'll say that again. If horse meat is being substituted for beef, that's a crime, and to resolve that, you need a food crime agency. So if somebody submits a paper that has been produced by ChatGPT, that is fraud. And you need a body that will investigate and prosecute that fraud. That's an entirely different point of view. So it then becomes possibly even a criminal offence.
Can I have one more food anecdote?
Go ahead.
This is a positive one, because another way to counteract that, of course, is through like developing a culture of honesty and transparency. And we were reading about the history of the croissant, as we say here in the US, the croissant, which we think of as a very French food, but apparently it's German. And the name means crescent. They originally were crescent shaped, but if you go to Paris, they're not crescent shaped, they're straight. And that was because French bakers were being honest and transparent about whether they were using butter or margarine. So the crescent shaped ones used margarine and the straight ones used butter, and French people preferred butter, so you don't find the crescent shaped ones anymore. But it's a way of being open and transparent because their baking culture is like that, or their food culture is like that, apparently.
This reminds me of a famous physicist who was asked to investigate a question of fraud. And this physicist produced a phrase that has resounded through the centuries. So the phrase is Eureka. The physicist is Archimedes, and the fraud was that the king had given goldsmiths gold to make a crown, and the crown had been returned and the weights were correct, but had the gold been adulterated and replaced by a baser metal. And Archimedes, in his bath, so the story goes, had realized that the apparent weight of the crown when immersed in water should be the same as the apparent weight of the same amount of gold when immersed in water. So this is a way of measuring the density of the returned item. I'm sorry if I haven't explained it well, you'll find it better explained in Wikipedia. And the story says he ran naked through the street. So excited was he to have solved this problem that the king had given him. And he shouted out, Eureka, Eureka, which means I found it. But that's a technical side of it. The king then had the responsibility of prosecuting the jewelers for fraud. And Elizabeth Pick, have I got Bick? Elizabeth Bick?
Mm-hmm.
She is playing the role of Archimedes, but who is playing the role of, but who is going to prosecute the fraudsters? Because perhaps that's what they are fraudsters.
Yeah.
Carve.
You're absolutely right. Yes, the fraudsters. Part of the problem, again, a compounding problem, is that the fraudsters, if we think of them that way, they're not really punished enough, if you like. The punishment is not a big enough deterrent. If you look at the Elizabeth's statistics, I believe she has found 4,000 or 6,000 papers with plagiarization. She's reported them to publishers. After, I believe, something around this, after 5 years, only 40% of those papers have been retracted. The majority are still there, and they've been cited. Yeah. So there are several layers to this.
But retraction is not punishment.
Sorry. Well, it's not even punishment, but it's the stage before punishment, but they haven't even been retracted.
Yeah.
So they're still sitting there. So there's not a big punishment, if you in a sense it's punishment, because it says this was retracted if they publicize it because these figures were plagiarized. Often the author will say, oh, we made a mistake, here you are, this is the figure, but no one asks, well, why did you send another figure? What happened? What's the history?
If I'm overbilled and I pay the bill and then recover it, that's not a punishment. That's a civil matter. That's equity.
Okay.
But if the overbilling was of such a nature that it has a fraudulent and criminal nature, then the person can, for example, be imprisoned, and that's not a civil matter. You can't be imprisoned for civil matters except for contempt of court. So to have the paper withdrawn is an appropriate civil remedy, but it's not punishment.
Okay.
So there will be an impact on the reputation of the person that is actually attempting to pass these plagiarized papers or AI generated papers.
I'm probably a bit hardline on all of this. Shall I stop the recording? Anybody that wants to stay can stay, of course. Next week we have, hopefully with better technical support, STEM and accessibility with our 3 special speakers, Jonathan Godfrey and Jason White and Patrick Smythe, all of whom are eminently qualified because they have personal experience of disability, and it is all part of trying to empower these people on the basis that they're the people that can help us get things straight, because they won't be fooled by our good intentions and our kind words. They will know whether it's working for them or not. So thank you for putting up with the slow start, and I'm gonna stop recording.